Welcome back to another video lecture for AP World History. Today, we're going to be talking about the Protestant Reformation. I find this one to be really interesting, and it's because of all the changes that took place at this time. So let's set the context for the story. So, under Constantine, the Catholic Church had become the national faith for the Romans, the Roman Empire. Now, keep in mind, before this time period, the Catholics and basic Christians of that time period were seen as sort of the heretics of the Roman Empire. Nobody really bought into what they were saying, but Constantine made them the national faith. Now, when the Roman Empire eventually falls, the Catholic Church is going to be the one major institution that remains consistent throughout this time period. In fact, it was after this time period, you might remember, that Charlemagne, the French king, eventually brings back Europe and tries to reorganize it. And one of his main foundations was to have the Holy Roman Empire in what we would call the Germanic areas, with the Roman Catholic Church in charge. Now, throughout this time period, there were a number of controversies that questioned and challenged the Catholic Church. One of the big ones that I find kind of funny was in the 1300s and 1400s, when there was a challenge over where the Pope should reside. And in fact, the church ended up electing 3 different popes in order to solve this problem. In the end, they came back to the same resolution, that the Vatican would be in Italy. But this was a real challenge to the Catholic Church's authority. Or take another example, the investiture crisis. This was a crisis where local kings demanded that they be allowed to anoint and appoint bishops. In the end, they lost that battle. The Pope was the one who ended up getting that power. But what it demonstrates throughout this time period is this desire for political power and separation from the power of the Catholic Church. So my thesis overall of the Protestant Reformation is that it did involve some really sincere beliefs, but in the end, what it was really about was about the desire of kings and princes to break free from the Catholic Church and to start to form nation states. Okay, so how does the Protestant Reformation actually get started? In fact, there had been a number of people who had dissented and challenged the Catholic Church in the past, but why was it that Martin Luther, the Catholic monk turned Protestant rebel, eventually was successful in creating this Protestant Reformation? Okay, so like I said, Martin Luther was a Catholic monk. He was very faithful and loyal to the Catholic Church. In fact, he talked himself about how much he loved the Catholic Church. But in the end, he broke away. Why did he do this? Well, he noticed there were a bunch of problems going on. Probably the big one that you've all heard about is indulgences. Now, many people have misunderstood what indulgences was really all about. The Catholic Church believes that you get into heaven through faith, but also through good works. One example of good works is paying indulgences, meaning that you just provide different amounts of money to help build things. And at the time, a lot of the Catholic churches and different types of institutions had fallen apart. So giving an indulgence or money was meant to help the church, help spread the faith. Not a bad idea. The problem was indulgences evolved into a process in which people could buy their way into heaven by doing this. That was what Martin Luther got upset about, not just the paying of indulgences. So eventually he wrote what are called the 95 Theses. And we all know the myth that he went and he pounded it by a nail onto a door. In fact, the truth is he mailed it to a bishop. But it became popular that he had sent out these 95 Theses. And so he was called to account for these. He was called to what was called the Council of Worms. And there he was told that he was wrong. He had to apologize or he would be condemned and excommunicated. So Martin Luther decided that he was going to break away from the faith altogether, which is what he did. He formed his own faith, and there were a number of major beliefs he had. But the 2 that we want to remember are sola fide, you are only saved by faith, and sola scriptura, you go to the Bible in order to find the truth. And why does all this matter? Because it's an undermining of Catholic clerical authority. How so? Well, in the past, it was the priests you would go to in order to understand the Bible, in order to understand how you might be saved. If you're basically telling people you're saved by your faith alone, and you can go directly to the Bible to figure it out, you're empowering people not to need any kind of intermediary, not to need a cleric or a priest. Now, why does this work? In the past, when people came up with these ideas, they were either excommunicated or they were eventually burned at the stake. So why is it that Martin Luther gets away with this? He got protection from a prince named Frederick, and that allowed him to be able to do all the things that he was doing. What this demonstrates at this time period was that, yes, the Protestant Reformation was about beliefs, but it was also largely about the political desire for independence from the Catholic Church. So this brings up the second big movement of the Protestant Reformation. Coming off of the heels of Martin Luther was a man named John Calvin. And John Calvin came up with this idea called predestination, or what I like to call double predestination. The idea is this: human beings, according to Protestants, John Calvin's Protestants, are absolutely corrupt. There is nothing good about us. Why? Because of original sin. Because of what Adam and Eve did and what we've inherited, we cannot do anything right. And that includes even choosing God. Well, if we can't choose God, then how do we get saved? God chooses us. But God chooses some and doesn't choose others. In other words, double predestination. Some people are chosen to go to hell, and some are chosen to go into heaven. The ones who are chosen to go into heaven are called the visible saints, or the elect. Those are the people that we kind of notice have all the virtues and characteristics of being godly or of being pure. Now, eventually, if that's true, John Calvin believed that you could form a Christian republic, and he attempted to do so in the Netherlands. It was there in which people had to follow the Bible and had to follow a strict code of Christianity. Now, eventually, Calvinism did spread out to places. For example, it spread out to France. In France, there were a group of Calvinists called the Huguenots, and the Huguenots tended to live out in the countryside. The Catholics tended to live out in the main city, or Paris, and they ended up in a huge civil war. The Civil War ended with a treaty called the Treaty of Nantes. And the Treaty of Nantes basically argued that people would be able to choose for themselves, or what we call today religious tolerance. Now, what's so important that I want you to see out of this was the development at this time period of independence from the Catholic Church and the starting of the tradition of religious tolerance or personal conscience. Okay, third example of the Protestant Reformation is what happened in England at this time period. So in England, you had Henry VIII, and Henry VIII usually is thought of as being this sort of lusty guy, right? He had 6 wives and he executed most of them. But that's not really understanding Henry VIII. Don't get me wrong. Henry VIII was a lusty guy. We have plenty of examples of that. But that was not Henry VIII's main concern. His concern comes out of what had happened in England for the last 100 years. In the previous 100 years, there had been a war between England and France. It took the entire 100 years. Think about that for a moment. We've been in Afghanistan for almost 20 years. People got tired of that. Imagine being in a war for 100 years. Well, in the middle of this 100 Years' War, England went through what was called the War of the Roses. And the War of the Roses was a civil war in which eventually the Tudor family would win that war. And Henry VIII was the son of that war. His fear was that if he didn't have a son, England could fall back into a civil war all again. Now, here's why that becomes important. Henry VIII initially married Catherine of Aragon. Catherine of Aragon was the daughter of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, right? The Spanish leaders of the Catholic Church. Well, Henry VIII was a devout Catholic. In fact, he even wrote a book, well, it was really ghostwritten for him, a book defending the Catholic faith against the Protestants. But Henry had a problem. Catherine of Aragon bore him no sons, and Henry VIII blamed that on Catherine. Now, at the time, he fell for a young woman named Anne Boleyn, who was one of the handmaidens of Catherine. And he believed if he could marry Anne Boleyn, he might be able to have a son and stabilize England. So he called for an annulment of the marriage. How could he do that? Well, he claimed that his brother Arthur had originally been married to Catherine of Aragon, which was true, and that according to biblical customs, you were not allowed to marry the wife of your brother. So off of that, he figured that he was going to be able to get away with annulment. The Catholic Church said no. Why? Well, you could go into religious reasons, but let's be honest. Spain was the predominant leader for the Catholic Church at that time period. To basically annul Catherine of Aragon for the country of England would have been a huge damaging mark. And so the Catholic Church said, we're not going to do something like that. Henry VIII said, fine, and he broke away from the Catholic Church, forming the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. Now, notice what's going on here. It's not really that Henry VIII is forming over religious doctrines. He's forming over political issues. And what are the political issues? Independence from the Catholic Church, one, but consolidation of a nation state also. Okay, so that deals with all the stuff with the Protestants. What about with the Catholic Church itself? Catholic Church went through its own Reformation at this time period, and it had to do with, hey, the Jesuits. So after the Protestant Reformation got going, the Catholic Church had its Council of Trent, which was a counter-Reformation, where they claimed that the indulgences were just fine, they were good works. Clerical priestly authority was really important. And that in the end, the Catholic Church was needed if you were going to have salvation. Well, Loyola ended up forming the Jesuits. And the Jesuits at the time were kind of seen as the warriors of the Catholic Church. It was their job to go out and defend the church against the Protestants. But there was something kind of interesting that happened with the Jesuits out in China. When the Jesuits went out to China to try to proselytize there, the emperor of China, a man named Qianlong, really fell to a liking of them. Why? Because the Jesuits were very intelligent when it came to things like math and science. And when they came into the court, they were able to make predictions that the Confucian leaders weren't doing a good job on, because the Jesuits were using more modern day parts of math and science. The Jesuits realized, though, that they needed to adapt to local Chinese customs. So they began growing out their beards. They wore the long flowing robes of Confucian leaders. They began integrating Confucian ideas into the Catholic Church. Even their masses were done differently. Instead of saying them in Latin, they would say them in Mandarin. They would sit on pillows around a table, and they would drink tea instead of wine. Well, the Roman Pope heard about this. He wasn't too happy about it. He basically told the Jesuits to stop or they would be condemned. At that point, Qianlong and the Confucian leaders were very suspicious of the Jesuits and said, "You're trying to make us into basically Europeans." And they kicked them out and said that they would not be allowed anymore to preach their faith. What's important, I think, to see off of this is what the Jesuits were doing. They were attempting to reform the Catholic Church for other cultures. In other words, they were demonstrating some of the problems with Roman Catholic authority. Okay, so what comes out of all these issues then, as far as the Protestant Reformation goes? It's the 30 Years' War. After Henry VIII had taken over in England, Europe, in Central Europe, ends up going through what's called the 30 Years' War. Basically, Northern Germany ends up fighting with Southern Germany over religious issues. Northern Germany was Protestant. Southern Germany tended to be Catholic. Now, how did they resolve this? At the end of the 30 Years' War, they resolved it with something called the Treaty of Augsburg. The Treaty of Augsburg said that it was going to allow for religious tolerance. I know what you're thinking. Does that mean that every individual gets to believe what they want? No, it didn't work out that way. The idea was every nation would form its own religious faith, and the people there would have to abide by it. So if Italy decides to be Catholic, everybody has to be Catholic. If Spain decides to be Catholic, everybody's got to be Catholic. But if the Netherlands decides to be Protestant, England decides to be Protestant, they will be Protestant. In other words, the idea of religious tolerance in the Treaty of Augsburg was to stop nations from fighting with one another by allowing for tolerance of national faiths. The reason why this is important is the development of something called national sovereignty, or the ability for a nation state to decide its own future. Okay, this gets us to our takeaways then. What are our three big takeaways to think about the Protestant Reformation? Takeaway number one. It's really important for us to remember that at this time period, there was a challenge to centralized Catholic authority. And the reason why that was happening was the desire for local authority that princes and kings had wanted for some time from the past. Takeaway number two, kings and princes basically saw the creation of nation states as being the way to use the Protestant faith as a way to break away from the Catholic Church. And the last thing that's so important I want us to take away is the development of this idea of a nation state. Under the Treaty of Augsburg, we start to see this idea of national sovereignty. And from here on out, in the modern world, we're going to see the development of nation states, each with their own belief system. Okay, I'll see you in class.